Welcome to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the Second World War from the Allied and Axis perspectives. I'm Jesse Alexander, a public historian specializing in the history of the two world wars.
And I am Matthias Strohn, German officer, professor of military studies, and author. In today's episode, we continue the story of the invasion of Norway in 1940. Hi Jesse, here again, another week, another podcast, Norway, part 2. So in the previous episode, we looked, as always, as we always do, at some of the strategic context, some of the political developments and the military planning. And I guess today it's time to take it there, to drill in and to have a look at the military operations. Do you think that's right?
It makes sense. Last time we took the story from Swedish iron ore moving through Norwegian ports all the way to the German invasion flotilla is on the water in the Baltic, in the North Sea, and ready to land on the Norwegian coast. So that is a summary of our 50-ish minute previous episode, dear listeners, in case you missed it. I do also want to remind all of you out there that this topic was voted on by our supporters. And if you also want to vote on which topics we cover in the future, you can do so by becoming a supporter of the podcast. You can do that at bothsidesofthewire.com. So, we talked a bit about the plan. Basically, the Germans want to occupy very quickly Denmark as a little springboard, but then pretty much all of those coastal Norwegian locations, the capital of Oslo, and then a whole bunch of ports that are sheltered by these very interesting fjords that can later be used as naval bases against the Brits, all the way up to the northernmost and probably most important one called Narvik. So, to do this, the Germans are risking a giant proportion of their relatively small navy. And of course, they're going to have significant air support. The Norwegians, on the other hand, are working with significantly less. Norway is a relatively poor country. It's also quite small in terms of population. So they don't have a top-notch military in many respects. They had some defensive plans to lay mines, to make access to their ports more difficult. Most of those have not yet been laid by the time that this invasion is happening. Their capital is Oslo. They have a bunch of forts there. Those forts are quite old. They have guns there, but the gun crews are not particularly well trained. So you're looking at a fairly minimal capability to defend themselves. The main fort at Oslo is the one that's kind of going to come into play most dramatically during the invasion. It's called Oscarborg. It is armed with, among other things, some very large German guns, German-made guns, I should say, 28-centimeter guns. That's pretty big caliber. And it also has the capacity to launch torpedoes into the harbor, which comes in handy if there's a naval force entering your harbor, which is one of the most dramatic incidents of the start of this invasion. I think we keep saying there's these dramatic incidents. We talked about the glowworm against the Hipper in the last episode. Well, the drama here is, there's quite a bit of it, but one of the locations is Oslo. But Matthias, I will let you pick up the operational story and take it where you wish, Oslo or elsewhere.
Well, let's continue with Oslo because it makes sense from a geographical point of view. And as you said, it is also the strong point of the defense here. Because Norwegians know that because of geography, it's going to be very difficult to defend the whole country. But it's also difficult to defend all these bases that they have that we talked about in the previous podcast that are of operational and for that you might perhaps even say strategic value. So it's really all about Oslo in the defense of the country. As we know, and as we've now said a number of times, of course, when we talk about Norway, we think of Narvik, but in the actual planning for taking over the country, seizing the country or defending the country, it is really it's more about Oslo. You already mentioned the fjords. You talked about Oskarborg, so the big fortress there, and that does play the main role because as the German task force sails in, as I mentioned, you've got the German cruiser Blücher here, and that comes into the spotlights at, I think it's roughly speaking quarter past 4 in the morning, 4:15, and these guns start firing at the German cruiser. The cruiser fires back. I think it was it Nelson who once said, "We'll never fight with a ship against a fortress." I think it was Nelson. That's the prime example. To cut a very long story short, so these Norwegian guns, that are actually German Krupp guns, which is quite interesting, 48 years old, so pre-First World War at that stage, but still good enough. They land a number of hits, and basically, in the end, cut a very long story short of this particular battle, make the ship, the Blücher, unmaneuverable, and is then later on sunk because there you then have more artillery fire being fired, and you also have land-controlled torpedo tubes, so they're fired as well, and the Blücher goes down. And that's about, with a loss of about 1,000 men. So that's quite big, particularly, well, first of all, of course, the men, but also when you look at the fact that the Germans have now lost this cruiser. And as we said now a number of times, the German Navy is quite small. So this is a big, big loss for the Germans. They still managed to land the troops down. And in the end, they managed to overcome these fortresses, and they managed to seize the capital as well. This also includes a landing of airborne forces at one of the main airfields. And this is actually against resistance. So if you want to make a lot of this, if you're an airborne person, this is the first time that you've got airborne forces basically landed against resistance in the history of warfare. So there we are. What I find personally also very interesting is that one of the pilots who lands this German plane there so people can jump out and conduct the battle from there is actually Reinhard Heydrich. So the guy, infamous Reinhard Heydrich, who then, of course, goes to Prague and is involved in the Holocaust and all these things. I think the name is probably familiar to people. Just again, think what would have happened if his plane had got shot down, but it doesn't. So I don't want to talk you through all the technical detail of what happens in the fighting because, again, we'd be here forever. Suffices to say that in the end, relatively quickly, once the Germans have been able to land these troops, the fighting in Oslo then is over and the Germans take over the city. However, because the landing had been delayed by the naval batteries and the fortresses, the royal family is still able to flee. So they jump on a train, they basically go north before they then eventually make their way to the UK. And one of the main objectives of the German forces landing there in Oslo was to capture the royal family, because they think this is important, because once you get the royal family, you can capture them, you can basically force them to make peace or whatever you want to do. So technically, Norway never drops out of the war because the government, i.e. the king, so not the government, but the head of state, basically goes to the UK. It's a government and the monarch in exile. And technically, Norway is, of course, occupied, but it never drops out of the war, so it's still a belligerent nation. Which also means, when you look at the Quisling story that we'll look at probably another time, so the occupation itself, that was, even by the standards of the day, was illegal. So that's the outcome, you might say, of that particular engagement. So it is over relatively quickly. There is some fighting, and particularly on the Navy side, quite a few people die and go down. Jesse, I can see that you're waving your finger. You probably want to say something and correct the mistakes I've just made. Is that correct?
No, absolutely not. I do want to add in a little detail about the Oslo action that I thought was pretty cool when I read about it. And if we have any Norwegian listeners, I want to do credit to people who've gone down in Norwegian history as heroes of this action. The commander of that fort, when those he's an interesting figure in the Norwegian semi-success, I guess you could say. We could frame it that way. They resist just long enough for the king to get out and keep this flame of resistance going and keep this flame of independence going afterwards during the occupation. And part of the reason that's able to happen, of course, is the decision of this one man who is responsible for the fort of Oskarborg. When the German ships enter the harbor, it's not clear whose ships they are. Maybe they're British, maybe they're German. At first, the Norwegians are not 100% sure. It's 4:15 in the morning. It's dark. And the commander, he has a decision to make of the fortress, right? Do I fire on these unknown foreign ships or do I not? And with all the potential political ramifications of that. And I don't know if this is apocryphal or if he really said this, but supposedly he said, well, I'm giving the order to fire and I'm either going to be court-martialed or go down in history as a war hero. And I guess from most points of view, he went down in history as a war hero. So quite a momentous decision for a guy who was commanding an old fort with an inexperienced garrison in a small neutral country until that moment. So kind of an interesting little wrinkle there. I would also mention that the country's gold reserves made it out along with the king. Perhaps almost as important as the king is the national,
Could argue that, absolutely.
Is the national gold reserve. Yeah, that was, I just wanted to add in that little interesting wrinkle about the commander of the fortress. His name escapes me. I didn't write it down. Forgive me, Norwegians. Put it in the comments so that everybody knows this guy's name. Took a momentous decision to resist with all the risks that entailed. But I leave it up to you, Matthias, to continue on with the invasion story.
Okay, so the Germans have now taken Oslo. So we continue that story there. So the idea really is this is the center of the country. We talked about this. And from there, you can also use the existing infrastructure network leading basically to the north, roughly speaking, in order to link up with the other areas that you've now, hopefully from a German point of view, by this stage seized. And these are, of course, the strategically and operationally important ports and bases on the west coast. And when you look at the other invasions that happen, or the initial invasions, they are, to begin with, successful. And I say to begin with because we, of course, need to return to the famous one, Narvik, later on. But the initial landing is successful, and so are all the other ones. So within, 24 hours, the Germans have seemingly achieved all the objectives. They've seized all the places that they wanted. They are now in control of the important part of the country, not the whole country, because they simply haven't covered all that and conquered all that landmass. But they think, this is looking reasonably good and reasonably well. There are one or two pockets, Norwegian pockets, that are still holding out. So, for example, there's a fortress, Hegra fortress, that holds out till, I think, it's always to double check, I think it's the 5th of May. So that's quite long. I'm not quite sure if we even said when the whole operation starts. So it's 10th of April it starts and goes on basically for 2 months. And this one holds out to the 5th of May. So that, by Norwegian standards, is quite a long one. So it's a very famous episode in the Norwegian defense of their country. But it's then on the 10th. This is 10th of June, so 2 months into the fighting. This is when eventually the Norwegian army in Norway surrenders to the Germans. And you might say with this, the campaign is over. I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but dear listeners, of course, we are returning to the famous action in a minute. I just want to give you the general gist of the story here. But as we already said, the king and the government, they manage to jump on a destroyer, they go to the UK, and that means that they are basically continuing the war from London. There are a number of very interesting actions. We talked about this joint aspect. So this is the army fighting together with the Air Force and the Navy. And particularly, I would say, on the German side, it's probably one of the very few episodes where you see all these three services fighting together. And so there are a number of incidents where the German Air Force sinks Allied ships, or German ships get sunk by the Royal Navy and also by the Navy. So you can see that's a really interesting campaign because you're bringing all this together, all these different aspects, which we don't have very often when we look at the European theatre of war in the Second World War. Very different when we go to the Far East, obviously, because you've got the sea lanes and you've got the big sea battles. Quite different when you look at the European theatre. So that, I think, is one of the incidents, or one of the reasons, I should say, that make this whole episode so very, very interesting. We also talked very briefly already about Denmark. I can perhaps just repeat the story because we are talking about Norway, because that's what our listeners asked asked for. But as I've said, I think in the last episode, you can't really talk about Norway without looking at Denmark. And again, I'm going to keep it very, very short. I talked very briefly about the last time around. Denmark is a bit unfortunate because you might say slightly flippantly, it is in the way. And that is the problem. The Germans can use it as a base, a springboard for particularly for their air forces. They also think if they control Denmark, they control the entry to the Baltic Sea, which is good because the Brits did have some plans to drive the Royal Navy into the Baltic Sea and take over the Baltic Sea. So you can see there's all that happening. But basically, it's unfortunate because it is in the way. And Denmark in the First World War, for example, had been used as the Germans as one of these trading areas. So you've got Denmark, which is neutral, and also the Netherlands. And of course, both countries, which in those days were still pro-German, more pro-German than, of course, they were after 1940 for obvious reasons, then get invaded, which is, what's the right word? Unfair, unfortunate, but whatever word you want to use here, dear listeners. I think you know where I'm going with this. And the invasion of Denmark happens mainly with airborne troops. So the Germans land airborne troops. There is a little bit of fighting at the main airfield outside of Copenhagen, where the Germans think the Air Force has already kind of bombed the place and they've taken over. However, the Danes still put up resistance. And that means that a number of German transport planes get shot down, which is relatively nasty on the German side. But in the end, they managed to seize the airfield. And then they get into Copenhagen. There is some fighting in the palace area. It takes a little bit of time, a couple of hours of fighting, but then the fighting is over. So it's basically the morning of that invasion. And then Denmark is under German control because the Danes quite sensibly say, well, there's no point in us fighting here because, the Germans are just too strong, too powerful. It's the big neighbor. So why should we do that? So that takes Denmark out. So I think it's just, again, important to throw this in again. So otherwise, we'll have lots of complaints from the Danes because we concentrate on Norway. And there is a point there. I mean, again, you can talk about occupation, all these things. Very interesting. But I think that probably is enough on that particular one. So
we might have complaints from the Norwegians that we mentioned the Danes at all. Who
that's
knows?
very true. You never know.
From the few Scandinavians that I've known over the years, there's very interesting regional rivalries there that go on. For the listeners out there, by the way, there is a fairly well-made, I think anyway, Danish movie about those few hours of combat, those few hours of invasion. There are lots of clips of it that can be found on YouTube, for example, but I suppose officially I recommend that you go the legal and copyright-safe way of acquiring that movie to watch it. But yes, it's a very interesting Danish-made movie about those few hours. I thought it was compelling anyway, the parts that I managed to see. So we now have the Germans in possession of basically all of the main coastal towns and ports of Norway. Are we ready, Matthias, to talk about the naval action at Narvik? Or did you want to add more about the seizing of the port cities initially?
I think that's probably enough. Otherwise, we lose ourselves in the tactical detail unless you've got some interesting snippet and story that you want to bring out and talk about.
I'm good. We've got snippets galore with naval stuff and then with Narvik and then with the occupation and so on. Maybe I'll throw one little political wrinkle in before we get to the big naval action that happens at Narvik that's quite interesting. Once the Germans arrive, this Quisling character sort of sees his chance, right? So he's been leading this fascist party kind of in the political woods in Norway. Now his heroes are there, and he steps up and says, hey, everybody, I've been waiting for you. Pick me, pick me. The Germans, though, are not that hot on him at first. They kind of brush him aside. But given that the king then refuses their kind of ultimatums, so the Germans are basically like, look, King Haakon, do what the Danes do. Just chill. Like, you have no chance. Let us take over. Here are the terms, right? But the king refuses. And in refusing, he also says, I don't think Quisling, I can't sort of reconcile myself to agreeing to German terms which now, because the Germans then warm up to Quisling fairly quickly, would mean that Quisling would become a main player in the Norwegian government, or the head of Norwegian government under the Germans. And the king is basically like, I'm not going to be a party to allowing this guy under the German thumb to take over the country, because I don't agree with his politics. So that happens even though the Germans have successfully taken all the main ports, basically. What happens then is that you have the German Navy that's exposed itself. So they went for this very bold and daring plan. They send a whole bunch of their rare ships, including their capital ships, like we talked about, the pocket battleships and cruisers and heavy cruisers. But now they're out there, and they're extended over like 800 or 1,000 kilometers along the North Sea, and the Royal Navy is going to react. So it's a matter of time before the British can bring to bear superior and far superior naval forces. So if you're the German Navy, you've done your job. The army now is in possession of these coastal towns and ports. You've got to get your behind back to safety as soon as possible, because otherwise the Royal Navy is going to toast you and send you to the bottom. At Narvik, the Germans have a group of 10 destroyers in the fjord. Now, fjords are pretty cool if you want to hide, but they're not that cool if you want to get out somewhere, because they're quite narrow and deep. Their plan of this group of German destroyers is to go back to Germany, of course. But as we always say, logistics is key. And what happens is there's a delay in refueling. So these German destroyers have to stay a bit longer. And lo and behold, 5 British destroyers show up at the mouth of that fjord. Now, the British are outnumbered, but we cannot accuse the Royal Navy of what we very often say the Allies are guilty of in the early years of the war, and that is inaction, lack of willingness to take risk, lack of energy, lack of maybe courage in some sense of the word, because the Royal Navy is going hell-bent for leather in the Norwegian campaign. So first you have the Glowworm taking on a cruiser. Here we have 5 British destroyers rushing in and attacking a superior number of German destroyers. They manage to sink a couple of the German destroyers. A couple more German destroyers arrive from outside the fjord. There's more fighting. A couple of British destroyers get sunk. In the end, the surviving German destroyers are still trapped in the fjord. And what happens then is more bad news for the Germans, because a British battleship shows up, the Warspite. And there is nothing a group of destroyers can do against the firepower of a battleship unless they get a lucky torpedo hit, which they do not in this case. The German destroyers, they slink back deeper and deeper into the fjord, so away from freedom and safety where they want to go. They go to a shallower part of the fjord where Warspite cannot go. But the British destroyers do their best impression of a honey badger, and they just don't give a hoot, and they attack anyway. In the end, they manage to sink all the German destroyers. In some cases, after the German destroyers kind of run out of hope and ammo and ground themselves anyways. But this is a very serious setback for the German Navy. They've just lost 10 destroyers at one go, and they do not have an infinite fleet of destroyers. So this is a very, very significant defeat. It also puts the German garrison in Narvik in a difficult position, because now the enemy has control of access to Narvik, and they also have far superior firepower that's available. So this German commander that you mentioned, Dietl, finds himself in a bind in Narvik. But I'll let you take up the story from there.
Absolutely right. But I wouldn't want to be in Dietl's or the German mountain troops' shoes at that particular stage. When you've just seized the objective, you can see your nice little destroyers moored up there, waiting to be refueled, 1 or 2 of them refueling. when then in these two engagements, so it's called the first, the second, sea battle at Narvik, so the 10th and the 13th of April, and basically the entire German, well, it's called a fleet, is sunk by the British. And I think you're absolutely right. Particularly the first action is quite impressive, very daring on the British side, just going for it. I mean, that's good seamanship and very daring and very dashing. And then, of course, you've got the second action. I don't have to repeat all this. In some ways, you might say the only good thing for the Germans that comes out of this is that this relatively weak army contingent, so roughly speaking, 2,000 men. Yes, they are experts because they're mountain troops. They know how to work in this environment, to be in this environment. But that's not a lot of troops. But these are now strengthened by all these sailors that don't die and that manage to get to shore, and that boost the German troop numbers. And you're looking at, roughly speaking, 16 to 1,800 sailors that now join the ranks of the land force. Now you can argue about how useful these are, because these are sailors. Are they used in mountain warfare? Are used to mountain warfare? And have they had mountain warfare training? No, obviously not. But in the end, boots on the ground matter. And that is important now, because you now set in motion the second stage of this famous Narvik operation, which is obviously the most famous one. So the Germans think they've kind of seized everything, they've done it, it's great. Then the Navy disappears, the Navy is sunk. So basically 50% of the German destroyers are sunk during this particular operation. So during the Norway operation, say after this, the German surface fleet becomes really, you might say, to a large degree irrelevant, which is quite ironic when you think about this, because one of the main reasons why they said we want to have Norway is because we want to have these ports, the fjords, for the big ships. I mean, they still have the big ones, the battleships, but everybody knows that even these can't stand up to the Royal Navy because the Brits just have got so many more ships and the Allies on the whole. So you can see the whole strategic rationale behind this doesn't really work. But that's, again, it's a different story. We've now drilled into Narvik itself. So Dietl and his men sit there and they look at this and they okay, we're here. What are we supposed to be doing? Because they know the situation is now going to be very, very difficult because they can't be supplied. So the Germans try to bring some supplies up and reinforcements, mainly via air, but it's a long, long way, and the Germans simply don't have that many transport planes. So that's difficult. And to make things worse now, the Allies are able to land because they have control of the seas. They are able to now land an expeditionary force. Go back to what we said about all this before. And so the Allies were actually thinking of seizing Narvik before the Germans get there. So this big debate that we had in the last episode. So who's to blame for this, so to speak, for the whole campaign? But they know that they want to get there. And there's a landing force that arrives now with British forces, also French forces, and of course you also have Norwegian forces fighting. And these forces, numerically much, much stronger than the German force, are actually able to push Dietl and his troops out of the town of Narvik into the mountains. And now think about the situation. Yes, it's the spring, but it's still, the weather isn't great. You sit in this mountain, on the top of this mountain, and you know what? We've got no supplies coming forward. There is no chance we will get reinforced, at least via the sea. There probably is not enough transport planes to supply from the air. So the only real option would be to be resupplied from the land using the roads. But you still have the Norwegians blocking these roads. There's still fighting going on. So what can these guys do? And this is one of the first times that Hitler actually gets quite desperate. And he says, you know what, this is all not going to work. And he contemplates giving Dietl the green light to move his troops into Sweden, to surrender to the Swedes. Don't surrender to the Allies, surrender to the Swedes, because that's a neutral country and you be interned. Dietl is kind of toying with this idea as well. But he then says, you know what, so we still got, roughly speaking, at this stage, about 4,000 or 5,000 men in this area, so we can still do something, and decides to stay put. And it becomes particularly on the German side, a very desperate struggle. They're really at the end of their tether, but they managed to hold out, sitting on this position outside of Narvik, being pressed from all sides by the British, the Norwegians, and the French. And why do they do this? Well, you might say fanaticism plays a role here, and perhaps we can have a quick look at Dietl as the general himself. So Dietl is Bavarian, and he is a diehard Nazi. So he fights in the First World War. He joins the Nazi party very early on, when it's still called the DAP. So it's the very early days, so not the NSDAP. Takes part in the putsch in 1923. All these things. So he's one of the old guard, you might say, very much trusted and by Hitler, who really believes in him. Also helps, of course, that he is Bavarian. He's not from northern Germany. He's not a Prussian, and he is mountain troops. That all kind of makes sense. So he's a diehard fanatic, and people have said that's one of the reasons why he says, no, we're not going to surrender. We're going to fight on. We're going to stay here. When eventually they win, and we talk about this in a minute, I'm just continuing very briefly with the Dietl story here. So he then stays in this area of Narvik, and he becomes the hero of the snow, as they call him. So the Held des Schnees, contrast, you might say, to Rommel, who was the hero of the sand and the hero of the sun. So you can see, again, it's propaganda, isn't it? That works. He's then put in charge of the troops up there in that region. He then continues the fight at the northern flank. Not particularly successfully, you might say. They managed to put in blocking positions, but they're not really able to seize any of the important objectives, like, for example, Murmansk and the Soviet Union, which they were supposed to. So all this doesn't really happen in this area there. And in the end, he then dies because there's a plane crash, and he goes down in a plane crash. What is also interesting, when you then fast forward and look at the German army after the war, for quite some time there was an Eduard Dietl barracks in Bavaria. And not that long ago, that was renamed, because they said, you know what, he was such a diehard Nazi. Well, even the mountain troops need to move away from this particular tradition.
Even the mountain troops.
Because to them, there's still something important. Narvik to the mountain troops still means something. Just like Crete means something to the paratroopers, Narvik is still something even today that people remember. But it's the context, of course, and the Dietl story. I don't think he was a particularly pleasant character. He even, when he was in command up there, he even spoke out and gave orders against fraternization with the Norwegian civilian population, because he said that Norwegian women weren't Aryan enough. I mean, that's quite bizarre when you think about it. So how can be more Aryan than the Scandinavians? But no, that's not good enough. So that in itself tells you something. But there is, of course, a sub-story to this. It's not a sub-story, but just an observation. And maybe Scandinavian, but maybe, dear Swedes, you can shed some light on this. Every time I've been to Stockholm, I haven't seen a single blonde person. So I always thought this whole Aryan thing that the Nazis came up with, not quite sure if that works. Very different other Scandinavian countries, but there we are. I'm not quite sure where this belongs, but I just thought it was an interesting observation I had when I was thinking about this whole idea of Aryan and Scandinavian people and all this. And Dietl says, you know what, even the Scandinavians aren't good enough. I mean, that it doesn't get more barking than that, if you ask me. So that's the Dietl character. So quite a fanatic fighting there. And the situation gets really, really desperate for the Germans. Because I've now said a number of times, they sit there, they can't be supplied. The Allies control the sea, so they can get resupplies in. But then something else happened. That's not at that particular, but it's in a different theater of war. Before we solve this riddle, maybe, is there anything that you would like to say about the actual fighting in Narvik? I've just given the very broad brush here. Maybe you want to fill in some of the gaps.
There aren't that many gaps, of course, in the broad picture, and I'm no detailed expert on Narvik. What I did find interesting about the story of this action at Narvik is that when the French and Poles arrive, because there's a small Polish contingent
they mentioned those,
as well. Should shout out to the Poles, who are still fighting on at this stage, in spite of their home country being under occupation. Many of these French and Polish troops are mountain troops, right? Because Poland has mountains. It's very flat, most of it, but in the south, it has mountains. And of course, France has the Alps. Britain, not so much. Not so much known for mountains. And the Scottish Highlands are not quite the equivalent of mountains as far as mountain troops are concerned. So the British troops initially, they do struggle a little bit in this territory around Narvik, but the French and Poles, this is what they're trained to do. So they are a big part of the reason why the Allies are able to do well, in addition to the 5-1 numerical advantage. The Germans, from what I've read, they are able to sneak in a couple of pretty useful extra supplies in spite of the pressure that they're under from the Norwegians as well. And those included a couple of mountain guns that were airlifted into them to give them a little more punch. This is always the Achilles heel of paratroopers that don't have heavy weapons. Well, some Ju-52 transport planes airlifted in some mountain guns and ammunition, which certainly helped the German cause in terms of being able to hold out until things shifted. Do we want to briefly... I'll just briefly mention Trondheim. This was another major, the other important Allied landing. It's a little bit later. It's on the 24th of April. The 24th of April is when they leave. Sorry. They land the same time as they land at Narvik on the 16th of April. Trondheim is not so far north as Narvik is. This is actually, I think, the first British-German ground combat of the war takes place there, if I'm not mistaken, but don't quote me on that. In any case, it doesn't go super well. The French arrive a little bit after the Brits, but by this time the Brits have already decided to evacuate. And they make that decision without consulting the French. So, and the Brits know that they're not being very cool about this. French listeners will not be surprised at this type of thing. There is a certain amount of bitterness about the way the British made decisions in the alliance, especially in 1940, of course. There are reasons for that. That's a whole other podcast, as Matthias would say. The short version is the Brits land, and then 8 days later, they leave. And the French then, of course, also have to evacuate Trondheim on the 24th of April. So it doesn't go well there. The British do have some biplanes that they send over for air cover, but the Luftwaffe is able to knock those out quite easily. So the air war, where the Germans have air presence, things tend to go better for them. However, in May, some other stuff happens that complicates the situation. Matthias, I'll drop that at your feet.
Yes, I picked the story up here. And of course, May 1940 is a big day in the Second World War, because this is on the 10th of May. This is the invasion of the West, so France, the Low Countries, by the Germans. And this, for the Allies, for the Brits, and also for the French, completely changes the strategic picture. So suddenly Norway is far less important than it had been beforehand. And they're concentrating far more on the battle for, as they would call it, the battle for France in those days. This is now the main theater. So particularly when they then realize that the Germans are advancing very, very rapidly through the Low Countries and also through France, you might perhaps say panic strikes. And the Allies say, well, we need to get all our troops to this main theater of war, because this is the war. This is where the war is being decided. And so relatively early on, so about 10, 12 days after the launch of the German invasion in the West, so on the 22nd, 23rd of May, the Allies decide to withdraw their troops also from Narvik, where at the moment it looks really as if they're winning. So the Germans, we talked about, the Germans can't really get there. They're under pressure from, we mentioned the Poles, I didn't mention the Poles, you're absolutely right, the Poles, the Norwegians, and also the French. They're pushing the Germans. So this is just, given another week or two, the Germans will have to surrender. Say, no, the situation has completely changed now, so we need to get these troops out here. They're trying to do this in a way that, of course, the Germans don't notice it. So they're still trying to hope that they will be able to win this battle before they then have to withdraw. The Norwegians, who get wind of this, say, no, well, let's launch another attack, which they do in early June, but again, cut a very long story short, the Allied forces are then evacuated between the 4th and the 8th of June. This is when they get back on the ships and they basically leave Narvik behind. The Germans can't believe their luck. And they say, what the heck is going on and where have they gone? And they reoccupy Narvik and basically stay till 1945. And that's on the 8th of June. And then 2 days later, the Norwegian armies where they lay down their arms and the fighting in Norway is over. So it's an interesting outcome. Again, you can see how bigger strategic considerations decide actions here. I personally have to say, I find this totally non-convincing what the Allies are doing here, because when you look at the forces that are involved, the numbers are still relatively small. You're looking at, roughly speaking, 20,000 Allied forces on the whole in this area against about, well, let's say 5,000 Germans at that particular stage. So these 20,000 are not going to make any difference in the great scheme of things in France. That's a division plus. That's all it is. However, if you keep them there, if you think about why they went there in the first place, and you think you might have to fight a long war, which the Allies were kind of still hoping they might have to fight, cutting off the iron ore supply would be quite a useful thing. So I don't really see this as a very clever move, as a good move. I'm also thinking that perhaps, again, playing devil's advocate, they were looking for a nice way out because they could see that this was no longer sustainable. They might win in Narvik, but the rest of the country had already been lost. So how do you get out there without losing too much face? There's something else happening which needs our attention. Norway, you're on your own. And of course, as you can imagine, Norwegians were really, really angry when they learned that the Allies were going to leave. I mean, for obvious reasons. So that's an interesting sub-story, you might say, to this operation and to the evacuation. And that is the reason, the official reason, which to me, when I put on all sorts of hats, does not really convince me in the slightest. But the Germans, I say, can't believe their luck. And it's interesting that in some parts of the world, so the first stage of this particular Narvik campaign is still seen as an Allied victory. So there is a film on this, for example, which tells you that the Allies won. You hear quite a bit of this, which is true when you look at the first stage, look at the naval engagement. We talked about this. This is really quite impressive, what the Allies do there. You look at how the Germans are being kicked out of Narvik. But when you then look at the final outcome, I wouldn't really call that an Allied victory. So you can understand why the German mountain troops still think that this is one of the big stories to remember, because you're fighting against a much, much stronger enemy, more or less cut off. And then through the help of other and outer, you might say, pressures and events, you end up victorious. So I think I would say that's actually more impressive for what happens on the German side. Not through their own doing all the time, because other stuff is happening in other theaters, but there we are. So I'm always mildly surprised when I hear that Narvik was a victory for the Allies, which I have seen, and there's a film, and I have heard this in conversations where people say this is a victory. It is very much a victory when you look at the naval engagement. That is very, very true, and there's no question about this. Everything else is slightly different. So even, as I said, even the Germans can't really believe their luck. Having been authorized by Hitler to be interned in Sweden and basically to surrender. So that's quite an interesting end or outcome to the story. Not decided in Narvik, not decided in Norway, not decided by the navies. We've talked about the navies quite a bit, but by some events happening in a completely different part of Europe, which again shows you the strategy and how strategy is influenced by, well, you go up by policy, but also by operational realities on the ground. Quite an interesting let's call it fact.
Yeah, I mean, look, if you're looking at it from a British or French point of view, your victories in 3940 are few and far between. You've got to grasp for whatever straws are available, and a temporary operational success at Narvik is one of the very few low-hanging fruit, I think, from that period of the war. During the evacuation, however, just to add a little nugget in there, the Brits do lose an aircraft carrier as well. The Glorious is sunk, I think, by the famous pocket battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau.
Exactly, it's the battle
if
group,
memory serves.
Mm-hmm.
And some listeners may or may not be familiar with another project I was involved with a few years ago with the real-time history production company called 16 Days in Berlin, which was about the battle for Berlin in 1945. And we mention in that documentary a Norwegian commander by the name of Otto Ruge. He's the guy who's basically in command of the Norwegian forces. We haven't really focused on him that much. He surrenders along with them on the 10th of June, and he ends up being liberated in April 1945 by the Soviets because he was held in a prisoner of war camp just outside of Berlin. So quite an interesting little bookend connection there. But you're definitely right, I think, to look with a critical eye on the Allied evacuation. It seems like no matter what decision the Allies make at the strategic level in the first couple of years of the war, it turns out to be the wrong one. Hitler saw it similarly. I don't often like to agree with Hitler, but in this case, he described the Allies kind of like slow action, missed opportunities. He described it as, in the English translation anyway, frivolous dilettantism. I wouldn't I don't use the word dilettantism very often, but
good word though.
But yeah, I think he's kind of got a point there. I have to grudgingly admit, I think they could have done something less bad. I don't know if they had that many good options, but probably something less bad or a little more daring in any case. If we look at the losses during the campaign, by later campaigns, it's quite minimal. The Germans lose 5,300 killed and wounded, 2,400 of those at sea. The Allies and British, French, and Norwegians and Poles, 6,600 killed and wounded, of which 2,500 at sea. So relatively small, but where it matters, of course, as we've referred to now several times, is the German Navy. Absolutely crushing blow against the capabilities of the German Navy. They lose a heavy cruiser, 2 light cruisers, 10 destroyers, 6 U-boats, and they don't have a ton of U-boats at this stage yet. And they lose 10% of their naval transport capacity. Plus the Hipper is damaged, plus the Scharnhorst is damaged, plus the Gneisenau is damaged. That is huge. That means you're not doing any more of these type of operations basically for the rest of the war if you're the German Navy. There are a few things happening in Mediterranean, but basically the German Navy is dealt a very, very serious blow. The Brits, of course, lose ships. They lose this aircraft carrier. They lose a bunch of destroyers and so on and so forth. But they can afford those losses. As Stalin once said, quantity has a quality all its own, right? I don't know if that's an actual quote, but that's what one hears. And it's true. The Royal Navy can absorb those losses, and the Kriegsmarine cannot.
Absolutely right. And that's, as you've now said, and we've said a number of times, it breaks the neck of the German Navy. And this is, from the German point of view, the big problem and issue. Or is it? Because then, of course, they decide to go for the U-boats anyway, so the whole dynamic changes. But I mean, this is an interesting one all in itself, the dynamic within the Kriegsmarine, the relationship between Hitler and the Navy, the whole idea about the surface fleet versus U-boats. I mean, again, I think here's yet another topic for another talk, because we did one.
What was the famous plan? The pre-war naval plan?
The Z plan?
Yes, the Z plan with like this huge surface fleet. I mean, this is just naval planners trying to get a lot of cool stuff from the government, I think, is how that works.
Some things never change, but there we are. Some things never change. But as you might know, well, the Germans, of course, they had an aircraft carrier, the Graf Zeppelin, so never finished. Then taken over by the Soviets in 1945, and that's pretty much it. But they were building one, and you might ask yourself, well, why? But again, that's a different subject. We definitely need to talk about this. We did an episode once on U-boats, but I think we need to do a bit more of the wet stuff at some stage. But that is the big problem. Absolutely right for the Germans. And you mentioned the numbers. It's quite interesting. I mean, look at the casualty figures, how low they really are for an operation that basically results in the seizing of 2 countries and basically changes the strategic structure and goes on in total for about 2 months. I mean, you mentioned the numbers. It's about 5,000 on the German side. You're looking at, roughly speaking, 6,000 on the Allied side. I mean, when you look at Denmark, we talked very briefly about Denmark. Again, the numbers are, of course, always debated. There's always cum grano salis, so with a pinch of salt, you have to take all of these things. But one of the sources says that you got in Denmark, 26 people are killed and 23 are wounded. I mean, you take over a country, so to speak, or you lose your country to someone else. It's quite interesting, particularly when, as you've already said, compare this to what happens later on in the war. when you look at statistics, 6,000, that is the casualties of the German army on the Eastern Front every single day. 20,000 Soviets are dead every single day. So again, you can see it's warfare at a very different scale at this stage. And this is also an interesting one. Again, if you go a bit big, so World War II does not equal World War II. So you really need to look at different actions, different campaigns, different periods within the war as well. And as I've now said a number of times, when you only and merely look at the human cost, as awful as that is, because every dead person is one dead person too many. But actually, these are very, very light casualties. Particularly, again, if you compare that to what's the frame of reference these people have. Of course, it's Poland, and it's the First World War. So that's, again, it's just an interesting one to throw out there as well. And then, of course, from 1941, 42, 43, 44, the war completely changes. And, well, these casualties here, as I said, well, this is something that sometimes gets sustained during half a day on the Eastern Front or a day. So it's just a very different type of war. Very, very interesting to see this as well.
Indeed. Worth pointing out before we round off this episode on that point of casualties, the French campaign is sometimes underestimated for how bloody it is per day, because there are thousands of dead per day, but it doesn't last long, you see? And so that is, again, it's on a different scale. It's much, much bloodier than we often think of it. But it is then, of course, eclipsed by far by the Eastern Front later on. So, that being said, we've now, I think it's safe to say, unless Matthias gives me a warning sign here, it's safe to say we've completed our second episode about Norway, thanks to our supporters voting in our poll that we had on our website, bothsidesofthewire.com, where you can also vote if you wish for future episode content. We will revisit Norway because we haven't told the story of the occupation, the resistance, the Quisling government, all sorts of covert ops going on as well in the country at the time. It still plays a strategic role, somehow passively, for the rest of the war. So we will talk about that. But for today, we're ending up the operational campaign in 1940. As I mentioned, if you also want to support us and vote on future content and get access to exclusive content in our war room, you can do that on our website. Thanks for listening and watching, and we'll see you in the next episode. You've been listening to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, a Battle Guide production. To support the creation of future episodes, consider joining our dedicated supporter community, where you can enjoy exclusive benefits and connect with like-minded individuals. For more information, please see the show notes, and if you appreciated this episode, please leave a review on your chosen podcast platform. Thank you for listening.
In today's episode, we continue the story of the German invasion of Norway in 1940. I want to say 1944. That's completely wrong. It's not 1944. They're not invading in 1944.
Not yet, anyway.
Invasion, occupation, and a lot of fighting in the snow, and a lot of air, and navy thrown in as well. That wasn't good, was it? I need to do something else. That's too long, isn't it?
No,
just take it out. If you want to, Linus, take it out.
Doesn't matter.
And just go with another podcast and what have you. So there we are. Okay. Stop the recording and start again, because that was just too confusing.
Hey.
Now I don't know how many minutes. It makes it a bit unfair for Linus, I guess.
Train wreck alert. Take two
Take
of
two
part
or
2.
5 or 10 or whatever it is. Yeah.